Fellas, with the rumours of Alexander Volkanovski rematching Yair Rodriguez instead of Evloev, this might be one of the most undeserved title shots we've had in modern UFC history. So I thought we'd go through some of the most undeserved title fights we've had in modern UFC history between title contenders that haven't deserved a title fight but have still been given one. And we'll go in there with the first one, which is going to be Alexander Volkanovski versus Rodriguez number 2, like I just said. Now, this isn't announced, but it is heavily rumoured, and a lot of people think it's going to be taking place at UFC 320 Mexico. Now, obviously, these guys have fought before at UFC 290, so they've fought before, and it was a dominant performance from Volkanovski. He absolutely broke down Yair Rodriguez in the feet. It wasn't really a close fight. He pieced up Yair Rodriguez, broke him down, hit him with a massive shot in the third round, and then went for the ground and pound finish and was able to get Yair Rodriguez out of there in one of his most dominant title performances to date. And then to make things worse after that, Yair Rodriguez headlines a fight night against Brian Ortega, gets submitted by Brian Ortega in the home crowd of Mexico as well. So he ends up being on a 2-fight finishing streak, both obviously losses. And then that brings us to UFC 314, where we see Volkanovski challenge Lopez for the belt, and we see Yair Rodriguez take on Patricio Pitbull, who was a debutant towards the end of his career in the UFC. Yair Rodriguez beats Pitbull by decision. Volkanovski beats Diego Lopez by decision. And the UFC decided that instead of giving Evloev the next title fight, the guy that Volkanovski's called for, the guy that's undefeated both in and out the UFC on a massive winning streak, they give it to Yair Rodriguez, who is 1-3 in his last 3 fights. He's already fought Volkanovski and been finished by Ortega, and he's coming off a decision win over Pitbull. And they decide to book the fight with Yair Rodriguez, or at least that's what's been heavily rumoured all over social media, that Evloev isn't getting the next title fight, and it is going to be Yair Rodriguez. I mean, we saw on Evloev's Twitter that apparently he's going to be fighting Volkanovski in December. He's going to have to fight somebody before. So what the UFC should have done, I mean, it's a simple match. It's Volkanovski versus Evloev. Even if you want to be one of those fans that complains about Dagestani's ruining the sport, Evloev isn't even that boring. His fight with Aljamain Sterling was one of the best grappling fights we've seen in 2024. And without a doubt, he's the most deserving contender in the featherweight division. Volk's even called for him. So I think Volkanovski versus Evloev, without a doubt, was the fight to make. And an even more obvious fight, Diego Lopez versus Yair Rodriguez. We saw the press conference at UFC 314, the rivalry that they had. That would have been one of the biggest fights you can put in UFC 320, even as like a co-main event. The rivalry that they had and the fight of that caliber in the featherweight division, that would have been massive. So Alex versus Yair number 2 makes no sense. Yair Rodriguez is, I'd say, at least 2 fights away from a title fight. Never mind just getting one off the bat against Alexander Volkanovski when Evloev's in the wing. So this is one of the most undeserved title fights we've had. And another one that's coming up as well, Merab versus Sean O'Malley. This is going to be for UFC 316 on the 8th of June. This is going to be the next pay-per-view headlined by Merab and obviously Sean O'Malley. Again, another massively undeserved title fight. Now, obviously, the first time these guys fought, O'Malley was the champion, and it wasn't an extremely dominant performance by Merab to the point where he won every round. But I definitely say that Merab should have won this fight. He went out there and won the fight comfortably. O'Malley had his moments, but Merab won the fight comfortably, in my opinion, and it wasn't that close of a fight to the point where O'Malley's granted an immediate rematch. And was O'Malley a long-reigning champion to the point where he could, ask for an immediate rematch? No, he had one title defense against Marlon Vera, and in that time, we've seen Merab go out there against Usman Magomedov and beat Usman Magomedov in again a fight of the year contender against him early this year. And Sean O'Malley's been sat on the couch tweeting, reacting to other fighters, and that guy hasn't, he's not been active. You've got PT who's on a 2-fight winning streak. You've got Corey Sandhagen, who just smokes Figgy. And the UFC decided to do O'Malley versus Merab too. And even Dana White at the press conference, when they did the launch press conference, couldn't give a real justification for why he's made this fight. It looked like a fish out of water when the crowd was asking him why he booked this fight. So what the UFC should have done, there's a couple of options they could have done. First of all, they could have done a title eliminator between Sean O'Malley and PTN. This was the obvious fight to make. First of all, it's a massive fight. Second of all, it would have been a fight of the year because we've seen it before and it was amazing. And it has big implications. Yan on a 2-fight winning streak, O'Malley a former champion, competitive rematch, booked the fight, and the winner gets a title fight. And then we could have fought Merab towards the end of the year, and if Pantoja wanted to move up in the meantime, maybe you do Merab versus Pantoja at UFC 316 instead of O'Malley. But listen, it's not one of the worst title fights I've ever seen, but Sean O'Malley's had one title defense against Marlon Vera, which in itself was a bad contender that he fought, and he's getting an immediate rematch against Merab when we've got a whole list of contenders that I'd say arguably deserve a title fight more than O'Malley. So another undeserved title fight. We've also got Sean Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis number 2 again this year at UFC 312 on the 8th of February. Now, the first time these guys fought, obviously Strickland was the champion, and this was a very, very close fight. They both made it very competitive. Some people thought Strickland won the fight. I personally thought Dricus did enough to get it done. It was an amazing fight. Dricus Dricus du Plessis ends up getting the decision win, and Strickland didn't have a single title defense during this time. He goes out there and faces Paulo Costa and gets a split decision win over Paulo Costa. Now, fair enough, it probably shouldn't have been a split decision, but it wasn't an extremely dominant win. He didn't really put the stamp on that victory, and Paulo Costa hasn't won a fight for years, and when he did win, it was against Luke Rockhold. We also saw Dricus go out there against Israel Adesanya, and he choked out Adesanya. And we could have done the Chimaev fight earlier this year. Obviously, Chimaev is undoubtedly the #1 contender. Even Caio Bravo has a better case. Again, undefeated in the UFC, a huge winning streak. But the UFC decided to book the rematch with Strickland. Again, not one of them massively against because of how competitive the first fight was. But I think what the UFC should have done, they could have easily done Chimaev versus DDP for the Q1 of 2025. Chimaev took no damage in the fight with Whittaker, which was on October. They could have easily booked this fight for February or like March of this year, or even like April. This fight could have happened by now. They could have booked this instead of the Strickland fight. And in the meantime, they could have done Strickland versus Brallo as a title eliminator. I think that Strickland was definitely one fight away from a title fight after the win of Acosta. Brallo's definitely a fight away. That fight could have been made like a fight night main event when it gets a title fight. So that's what I think this UFC should have done. Again, it's not criminal that Strickland got a title fight, but I think there was a range of contenders that made a lot more sense at the time than Sean Strickland. Another one, Islam Makhachev versus Moicano. Now, obviously, this one's a bit different because it was originally supposed to be Makhachev versus Saruki, and that was the fight that was supposed to go down. Arman Tsarukyan decides to pull out a day before the fight, so the UFC decided to drag up Renato Moicano up and fight Tsarukyan, so that ended up being a very short notice fight where Islam Makhachev obviously makes easy work of Renato Moicano, as a lot of people expected. So this one I'm not going to talk about too much because the UFC didn't intend to put that title fight on, it goes without saying. It was a short notice fight, but again, it was a free title shot for Renato Moicano. Another one, UFC 310, Pantoja versus Kai Asakura. Now, the UFC, obviously Kai Asakura was a massive star in Rising. He was a big star in Japan, so the UFC decided to bring him over to the UFC. And it was kind of known for a while that we were going to see Kai Asakura, but we didn't really know, first of all, which division he was going to be competing in, and first of all, who was going to be fighting. And there was a range of contenders that I would say have earned a title fight, but Kai Asakura decides to skip the queue. He gets above all those contenders and decides to book Pantoja versus Kai Asakura for UFC 310. And just as expected, Pantoja makes pretty easy work of Kai Asakura. And now they've got Horiguchi as well, who signed to the UFC, who I think is better than Kai Asakura. And they're giving him Tagir Ulanbekov, which makes no sense, or at least that was the fight that was supposed to happen. Which again makes no sense how Kai Asakura gets a title fight and Horiguchi faces Ulanbekov. So what the UFC should have done is Pantoja versus Kara France. Kara France should have beaten Merab. That should have gone to him, and he just knocked out Steve Erceg. So that fight should have been made for early 2025, in my opinion. Maybe add that to UFC 312, or maybe not 3 title fights, but just stick it on a card early this year. I think Pantoja versus Kara France first would have made sense. And in the meantime, give Asakura a top contender. I'm not saying you need to give him like a Tagir Ulanbekov, but like a Royval versus Asakura would have made sense. Royval's one fight away from a title fight. Asakura, bring him over to the UFC, builds the name of Royval if he can beat Asakura. That would have been a perfect title eliminator. So I think Pantoja versus Kai Asakura, I'm not a massive fan of fighters coming over to the UFC and getting an immediate title fight. I know the flyweight division hasn't really got too many top contenders that haven't fought Pantoja already, and Asakura was a big star, but to give him a title fight immediately in the UFC, I think that was quite undeserving. And then one of the biggest ones, Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic. Let's just do a mini heavyweight timeline. March 2021, Stipe Miocic gets knocked out cold by Francis Ngannou. January 2023, Francis Ngannou leaves the UFC. March 2023, they book Jones versus Gane for the heavyweight belt. Jones submits him. November 2023, they book an interim title fight between Pavlovich and Aspinall. Aspinall knocks out Pavlovich. Nearly a year later, July 2024, Aspinall then defends that same interim belt against Curtis Blades. And in December 2024, Stipe has made a comeback 3 years later after getting knocked out. And he's going to be fighting Jon Jones for the heavyweight belt. So you've got Tom Aspinall, who was on a 3-fight KO in the first round streak, and before that he'd lost to Blades, but it was by injury. And he was the defending interim champion. You've got Stipe, who's coming off a knockout loss to Francis Ngannou back in 2021. And the fight went exactly how people expected. Without a shock, Jon Jones dominates Stipe Miocic and finishes him in round 3. Now, what the UFC should have done, it's simple. Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall. I've said this a million times already. That's the fight that needs to be made. It doesn't need explaining why. And if they were so desperate to get Stipe back in the mix, either you do the winner of Jones and Aspinall against Stipe, or you just do Stipe against the top contender like Cyril Gane. You know what? With the way that Cyril Gane's been performing in his last couple of fights, it wouldn't surprise me if Stipe would find a way to win, but he'd probably get pieced up by Gane. But either way, Jones versus Miocic being a title fight was a disgrace. Even the first time around, it was a disgrace. Never mind the second time when Aspinall not only had the interim belt, but had also defended it. That was one of the worst title fights we've seen. The build-up, even the fight itself, everything about that fight shouldn't have been made. Jones Miocic, one of the biggest examples of an undeserving title fight. Then we've got Alex Pereira versus Khalil Rountree. Now, obviously, Alex became champion in November 2023. After that, he defends against Shamal Hill, and he defends again against Jiri Prochazka. And then you look at the light heavyweight division. I mean, he's already beaten Jiri Hill and Jan Blachowicz. You can cross those guys off. And there was a clear contender, number 2 in the division, Magomed Ankalaev. Ankalaev was on, well, he was on a bit of a winning streak. He was 10-1 in the UFC at the time of facing Alex, and he had 5 ranked wins. That should have been the fight to make. Alex Pereira versus Magomed Ankalaev, potentially in Abu Dhabi or just anywhere in late 2024. That should have been the fight to make. But they bring out number 8 ranked Khalil Rountree. Now, Khalil Rountree was on a winning streak, to be fair to him, but he's 9-5 in the UFC, and he had 1 ranked win against Anthony Smith. And the UFC decided to do Ankalaev versus Rakic with Morton, which made no sense either, because Rakic was also on a bit of a losing streak too. Now, don't get me wrong, Rountree versus Alex was a way better fight than Alex versus Ankalaev. So from a fan's perspective, I'm not hating on the fight. I'm not saying it was disgraceful that the UFC did that fight, because it was a banger. It was one of the best fights of 2024. But if we're talking in terms of who deserved the title fight, it wasn't Khalil Rountree. What the UFC should have done is Alex Pereira versus Ankalaev should have been booked in October. No, I'm not saying they had to do it in Abu Dhabi, but that fight should have been in October, at least late 2024, before the Rountree fight. And if they wanted to put Rountree in contendership, Rountree versus Rakic was the fight to make. Rakic was coming off a few losses. Rountree was coming off a few wins. I think from a striking perspective, that would have been a banger of a fight, just like Rountree and Alex. So that should have been the move the UFC should have gone to in the light heavyweight division if they wanted to give it to the more deserving guy. But it is what it is. Alex versus Rountree, another undeserved title performance. Then we had Dricus versus Adesanya at UFC 305. Now, obviously, when Israel Adesanya was the champion, he had that fight with Alex Pereira where Alex manages to finish him, becoming the first guy to beat him in the middleweight division. Then the rematch, Adesanya knocks him out cold to become the champion again. Then we see Adesanya versus Strickland for his first title defense on his new run, and he gets beaten pretty comfortably, dominated there, I say, against Sean Strickland. And then we see Strickland versus Dricus. Dricus beats Strickland. And then we see Dricus defend his belt again immediately against Israel Adesanya. And Adesanya at this time had won 1 in his last 3 fights. He'd lost 2 title fights. He'd been finished by Alex and just come off a dominating loss to Sean Strickland. When you had Imavov, you had Baralo, you even had Strickland himself in the mix as well. Now, I understand why the UFC made this fight again. I'm not saying it's criminal because they had a massive rivalry. And to be fair, Adesanya was a pretty dominant champion, but Adesanya had already lost to Alex and he only had 1. He didn't even have a single defense since his long title reign. And obviously, we saw the fight. Dricus got the finish against Israel Adesanya. So what the UFC should have done is they should have done a title eliminator between Adesanya and Imavov. Now, obviously, we did just see this fight in Saudi Arabia, but it would have made more sense to book this fight before Adesanya got an immediate title fight against Dricus, so we could kind of earn that title fight and soak at Imavov. It secures number 1 contender, and then the winner could fight Dricus du Plessis at some point in 2025. So I think Dricus versus Adesanya, again, it's not criminal, but another example of a title fight that could happen instead. Alejandro Pantoja versus Steve Erceg at UFC 301 on the 4th of May. Now, obviously, after Pantoja beat Royval at UFC, I think it was 296, there was a couple of contenders that you could have given the flyweight title shot to. This is when flyweight wasn't doing too bad. You had a Merab, who's on a winning streak, undefeated in the UFC. You had a Mohamed Makhachev, who's on a winning streak, undefeated in the UFC. You had Manel Kape, who had a really good performance on a 4-fight winning streak. But the UFC gave their title fight to number 12 ranked Steve Erceg, who had 3 fights in the UFC. 3 fights and he'd already been giving himself a title shot. Now, to be fair, it was, again, a very close competitive fight. It isn't like Steve Erceg shouldn't have been in there with him, but for your 4th fight in the UFC to be a main event against the defending champion in Pantoja was, it didn't really make too much sense. So what the UFC should have done is, I think they should have done a title eliminator between Makhachev and Albazi. I think that would have been a good fight. 2 top contenders who I'd say were about 1 fight away from a title fight. Maybe do like a crowded fight night main event. Albazi versus Makhachev, title eliminator, winner gets a title fight. And instead, you do Steve Erceg versus Kai Kara-France. If you want to get Steve Erceg in contendership, put him against a top contender. And I think the Kai Kara-France fight would have made a lot more sense before the fight with Pantoja. That could have, again, kind of been a little bit of a number 1 contender fight after the Albazi versus Makhachev fight. So I think Pantoja and Erceg, another example of a bit of a undeserving contender. Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Vera, number 2 at UFC 299. Now, we saw Sandhagen versus Marlon Vera in a fight night main event back in February 18th, I think it was 2023. And we saw Sandhagen win that fight comfortably. It was a split decision, but it shouldn't have been a split decision. It should have been unanimous. Sandhagen won that fight comfortably. We then go out there and see Sean O'Malley knock out Aljamain Sterling, becomes the bantamweight champion of the world. Rightfully so. And since that, we saw, well, not since that, but since the fight that Sandhagen and Marlon Vera had, Sandhagen went out there and beat Rob Font, and Marlon Vera beats Pedro Munoz. And by the way, Pedro Munoz has been losing left, right, and center. That guy struggling to get a win. So you've got Corey Sandhagen, who's on a 3-fight win streak, one of them being Marlon Vera, and they give the title fight to Marlon Vera. Now, to be fair, again, they have fought before of O'Malley and Marlon Vera, and Marlon Vera has a win over Sean O'Malley, so you can kind of argue that they gave the title fight because Marlon Vera has a win, but it was an injury win, and we saw it in the fight. This is one of of the most dominating title performances of 2024. Sean O'Malley beat the crap out of Marlon Vera, picked him apart, pieced him up, nearly broke his face in that fight. That was one of the most dominant title fights I've seen. So what the UFC should have done is O'Malley versus Sandhagen. Sandhagen's been a top contender for a long time, and I don't think there was a time when he's been more deserving of a title fight than after he beaten Rob Font, because the guy already beat Marlon Vera, and he did it in good fashion as well. And you should have done Marlon Vera versus Pete Yan. If Marlon Vera wanted to face a top contender, which he should have had to do rather than beating Pedro Munoz, do Vera versus Yan, and then maybe the winner of that fight could have got a title fight too. So Sean O'Malley, Marlon Vera, another example of a really undeserved title opportunity that they gave to Marlon Vera. Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington. Now, obviously, after Leon Edwards had that massive head kick KO over Kamaru Usman and became the champion, he went out there and defended that belt against Usman in the trilogy, which was rightfully so for Usman because he'd already been a defending champion. And you look at the welterweight division. You had Gilbert Burns, who was coming off a win over Jorge Masvidal. You had Belal Muhammad, who was on a big winning streak, a big unbeaten streak. And the UFC booked the fight, Belal Muhammad versus Gilbert Burns, which we thought was going to be a number one contender fight. Belal Muhammad goes out there and he beats Gilbert Burns pretty comfortably. You know, it was a pretty dominant performance from Belal Muhammad across 5 rounds. And the UFC decided to whip out Colby Covington versus Leon Edwards. The same Colby Covington that was 2-2 in his last 4 fights, coming off a win over washed Jorge Masvidal. What the UFC should have done is Leon versus Belal. That should have been booked in December of last year, or 2023, instead of Colby Covington versus Leon Edwards. Covington hadn't deserved the title fight. Belal Muhammad had. So Edwards versus Belal Muhammad should have been the fight to make. And in the meantime, if Covington was so desperate to get in contendership, beat your top contender, you pussy. Do Colby Covington versus Shavkat Rakhmonov, a title eliminator. At this time, Shavkat, I think he'd beaten Jeff Neal because this was before the Stephen Thompson fight. So maybe on the same card, you could have done Covington versus Rakhmonov, where the winner of that fight would have got a title fight too. That would have sped things up in the welterweight division. So Edward versus Covington. Covington had not deserved the title fight. I think Dana's excuse was that Covington weighed in as the backup, so he got a title fight. When we've seen on multiple different occasions, fighters weighing in the backup as not get the next title fight. So another undeserved title contender. Usman versus Masvidal number 2 back in 2021. Another massively undeserved title fight. Now, these guys obviously fought the first time at UFC 251. Masvidal was on a 3-fight winning streak. Usman had already had a defense. This fight made sense. Now, it was a boring fight. Usman kind of just clinched Masvidal and toe stomped him for the entire fight. But it was a dominant performance, and he got the win. After that, we go out there and see Kamaru Usman brutalize Gilbert Burns, knock out Gilbert Burns, get a dominant win. And then after that, we see Masvidal get chucked in there in an immediate rematch. Masvidal gets another rematch. Bearing in mind that we had Leon Edwards, who's on a 10-fight unbeaten streak. We even had Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, who's on a 2-fight winning streak at the top of the division. We see the rematch between the two of them, and Usman beats the brakes off him. He was outboxing him the entire fight, and then when that right hand landed, absolutely knocks the fuck out of Masvidal, and still one of the best knockouts in modern UFC history. So what the UFC should have done is they should have done a title eliminator, Covington versus Masvidal. We obviously saw that fight in 2022, but that fight should have been instead of Masvidal versus Usman. That fight should have happened as a number 1 contender fight. Therefore, Covington would have been a lot more deserving, and Masvidal would have earned a title fight had he beaten Covington. So that fight should have been made there and then the winner can fight Kamaru Usman. Also, Usman was already active enough. That guy was fighting every like 5 months, so he could have waited a little bit more for this fight to take place. Covington, Masvidal, winner fights Usman. So Masvidal, I get the first fight was on short notice, but the fact that he had an immediate rematch without getting a single win, I think wasn't really deserving. Deiveson Figueiredo versus Joseph Benavidez, number 2. Now, Benavidez was on a 3-fight winning streak coming into the first fight with Deiveson Figueiredo. And we see the fight go down and he gets knocked out by Deiveson Figueiredo. Now, at this time, the UFC could have done maybe Moreno versus Figueiredo, or maybe even Roy Val, who's on a bit of a winning streak. But they booked the rematch between Figueiredo and Benavidez, and when I tell you this is one of the biggest beatdowns in UFC history, Figueiredo could have been charged for torture in this fight. He beat the absolute crap out of Benavidez. He dropped him multiple times. He bullied him with ground and pound, and to put the cherry on top, got the brutal submission win, which had Benavidez screaming. If this would have gone the full first round, this would have, in my opinion, been a 10-7 round. One of the most dominant rounds we've seen in UFC history. What the UFC should have done is they should have done Moreno versus Figueiredo. Now, obviously, we ended up seeing that fight 4 times, but that should have been at this time instead of Benavidez versus Figueiredo. And you know what? Benavidez should have retired. That guy shouldn't have been competing in the UFC. That guy was way past his prime. He was coming off a KO win. He shouldn't have been gifted that title fight. So Figueiredo versus Benavidez number 2 should not have gone down. Benavidez shouldn't have been anywhere near the title picture, and we saw that in the fight with how dominant Figueiredo's performance was. Peter Yan versus Jose Aldo, UFC 251. Now, Peter Yan got the title fight for the vacant belt because he was on a big winning streak and he was undefeated in the UFC. Made sense. Aldo kind of just got a title fight for being a bit of a legend. At this time, we had Aljamain Sterling, who's on a 5-fight winning streak and just submitted Corey Sandhagen. We had Marcin Marlon Moraes, who was coming off a good win over Jose Aldo himself. And we had Aldo, who was 2-2 in his last 4 fights. And bearing in mind that he'd already lost to Alexander Volkanovski and lost to Marlon Moraes as well. in some of those losses, and then the UFC just decided to whip him in a rematch, ripping him a title fight in there with PTN. So what the UFC should have done is Jan versus Sterling again. We ended up seeing this twice, but this should have been instead of the Aldo fight. I think for Sterling to beat Aldo, not beat Aldo, but for Sterling to beat Sandhagen, he should have earned that title fight instead of Jose Aldo. And they should have done Aldo versus Cruz. If Aldo was going to be at the top of the bantamweight division, it would have made more sense to give him a bit of a legend rather than a title fight with PTN. It should have been Aldo versus Cruz. Cruz was still active at the time. Cruz, Aldo, potentially a #1 contender fight, and then Jan and Sterling, which would have made a lot more sense for the state of the bantamweight division. Another one we have is Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero in 2020. Now, Yoel Romero was on a massive winning streak and was a beast in the UFC in his prime. So they give him a title fight against Robert Whittaker. He loses the fight against Robert Whittaker. After that, he goes out there and knocks out Luke Rockhold, gets a rematch with Robert Whittaker, and again, loses Robert Whittaker for the middleweight belt. And then after that, he immediately loses again to Paulo Costa. So now he's on a 2-fight losing streak, and he gets a title fight with Israel Adesanya from that losing streak. Bearing in mind that he'd lost 3 of his last 4 and was on a 2-fight losing streak, he got the title fight with Adesanya. And I understand there was quite a bit of hype, but the fight was opposite of that. It ended up being one of the most boring fights, not even just title fights, but fights in general we've ever seen in UFC history. It was a staring contest across 25 minutes, one of the worst title performances we've seen. So what the UFC should have done is Adesanya versus Cannonier, because at the time, Cannonier was, I think he'd just beaten Jack Hermanson in enemy territory, and that was when Jack Hermanson was like a top middleweight prospect. So that would have made a lot more sense to give Cannonier the title fight instead of Yoel Romero, and I think Cannonier was on a winning streak. And they could have done Romero versus Brunson. At this time, Romero was on a 2-fight losing streak. Brunson was coming off a few wins. Brunson versus Romero for maybe like a title eliminator would have made a lot more sense. So I get the fight had a bit of hype and people wanted to see, but Romero getting a title fight on a 2-fight losing streak never really made any sense. Now, some honorable mentions that you could have gone in there: Adesanya versus Strickland. You could have also mentioned Perez versus Figueiredo, Sterling versus Hudo, Chandler versus Oliveira. I feel like these can kind of be borderline undeserving, but I'm not going to say they're just straight up undeserving and they should not have been given a title opportunity. But a fun fact about this is every single undeserving contender ended up losing their title fight as well. So it kind of just goes to show that when there is a dominant champion, if you're just going to give them an undeserved contender, if you're just going to chuck someone in an undeserved title fight, the chances are they've not done enough to obviously be in there with the champion, and therefore they're going to lose. But that is some of the most undeserving title shots we've had in modern UFC history. Let me know if I've missed any off, and if you agree, disagree with this list. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.